Hello everybody and welcome to Adobe Live. We would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we are creating and streaming from today and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Flynn and I am here with the fantastic illustrator Jeremy Lord. Hi Jeremy, how are you?
Morning, how are you?
I'm good. My voice went really high pitched there for some reason. Hi Jeremy. But it is good to see you. Always good. We had a great little pre-chat about computer games and grinding and all sorts of stuff, which kind of lends itself very well
Sure did.
To what we are chatting about today. I just need to fix up a little scene here because that little line's going to bug me. There we go. That's better. Hi everyone and welcome. Great to see you. If you are around, if you're watching, please jump in and say hi. We always love to hear where you're tuning in from. And this is an interactive session, so if you have any questions, throw your questions in chat as we're rolling along. This is a continuation from our stream. Music too low? Okay, turn it up a little bit. From our stream a week ago. So that was a part one. This is part two. I think Jeremy, maybe we'll do a little bit of a recap so people that may have missed can jump in and check out what we did last week. And if you're watching on YouTube, jump on over to Behance. That's the chat that we keep an eye on. But if you can't do that, we'll keep an eye on YouTube as well. We'll do our best, okay? Guaranteed interactivity in Behance live chat and 50-50 in YouTube. But where do you want to start? Should we have a look and do a bit of a recap, Jeremy?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's get a bit of a recap. So we're doing pixel art, which is always like something that I think is super fun to have a look at for the way that you do it, what it kind of ends up looking like, the references that it kind of brings up in people's brains. And just, like a really very different way of using Photoshop to create illustrations. So we started with this sketch. We did a few kind of different things. We looked at kind of, like how much stuff do we put in? What's the hand that we got? Do we have a different hand going? Where do we kind of bring in all these different things that we can start to play around with? And then bringing that into some pixel art. So this is just like a good resolution, just normal, using a brush in Photoshop, making a sketch. And then what we get is, spoiler alert, we bring that into Photoshop and just kind of rescale it a little bit. And we talked about kind of different ways of scaling and all the different options for the tools to get something like this, which is a little bit of a mess. Very, very different to the clarity of this, but these are the things that we got to do. So we've created a file that is in pixels, 128 by 128. So a nice little square. Doesn't have to be a square, but good to go in multiples of 2. So binary, so 2, 4, 6, 8, 16, 32, 64, all the things that we're used to hearing in terms of like bit rates. And based on that, we have created this kind of an outline. Let me drop the opacity on this to work on. So there's a few different things that we spoke about in terms of line quality as well. Where do you put your pixels? Where do you want to go? Sacrificing detail for getting the shape. And that actually leads me to one of the main changes that I've done in between last week and this week, which is this hand. So this hand that's like kind of coming out towards us, getting ready to use his katana, which I've kind of done this like Gundam inspired, but this hand, it was just not working. So I tried to do this hand and kind of rescale it, and it just wasn't working. And so on a separate layer, as you can see here, I've got an outline.
Just a quick question. Like, what wasn't working about it? Was it because it was too complicated, because it was so big and it was trying to be really curvy?
I think that's probably it. It's probably just too, it's also kind of a distorted perspective, which is not really very kind of keeping in line with pixel art.
Right.
Because this is more of like a full-on illustration.
You compare the hands, right? Like the one and the that's holding the sword, compared to how much real estate that hand is to give it that sense of that makes sense. Yeah, that it might not be a pixel kind of base thing, so it's clashing a little bit.
It's also, I think, there's also very difficult to draw like this, but I think the main thing is you kind of want your pixel art poses to maybe even feel a little bit basic, because like everything about pixel art, it's not a style to look a certain way, even though that's what we do it now. Back in the days when this was every video games, it was a necessity to make up for the lack of like power behind the machines and consoles that you were playing. And so you couldn't get super smooth animations, and you couldn't get a lot of detail in the poses. So you get these really, like, if you think of like Super Mario and all these things, like the poses are real janky. They're not very smooth. They're not very natural. And so I just think like this hand was a little bit too realistic. It wasn't kind of like gamey enough. And so I've gone for this kind of like bracing himself kind of pose. A little bit easier to draw, yes, but also just feels a little bit more video gamey in terms of like what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And a little bit more like kind of side scrolly. So this is what we've ended up with. As you can see, I've put it on a separate layer, just so that I can kind of move it around and see, like, once I'm like perfectly happy with it, what I will tend to do is grab these two, Command J to duplicate, and then smash them together with Command E, and then I can rename this my shorthand for outlines. And then I won't get rid of these at this stage. I'll just stick them in a group and hide that group and drag it down to the bottom, so that I can just like forget about it. But now I've got all my outlines on the same layer. This is a personal thing for me. It's just like a way of working. There's no right or wrong when you're doing anything really in any of Adobe programs. There's just kind of like your preferred way of doing a thing. The reason I do this is because if I want to make some edits, and I will later on in this episode, I will make some edits to the outline. If I have it on two separate layers, it's just an extra like micromanage thing to do. It's like, I got to do those changes to the other layer. I can't like, or I want to erase it. It's like, oh, why is it not erasing? Oh, it's on a different layer. All that kind of stuff kind of annoys me a little bit. So I've kept the workability option if I want to make some edits later on, or if the client needs to make some changes later on, which is a bit more likely. But for the sake of me kind of working on this, I'm just going to keep it all on the same layer, at least as far as the outline goes.
Right. Okay.
And then we started also putting in some basic colors into this. So one of the things that we looked at is this needs to be Gundam inspired. So I don't necessarily want it to be an actual Gundam. And this is just your classic like Gundam colors. There's a range of different Gundam variants as well. This is the like standard Gundam. How many times can I say Gundam? But yeah, so we don't like, obviously like copyright and everything else, but it's also like we want to have a little bit of fun with this guy. So I've made him a little bit kind of like Shogun, Edo period, samurai sword kind of thing. I've changed the kind of the spikes on his helmet. I've changed his helmet and his shoulder pads, given him kind of leg guards, all these kind of different things that are like, cool, it's a Gundam, but it's a samurai Gundam. But then I want to play with the colors a little bit. So we started messing around with the colors, but I don't want them to be too realistic. So at this stage, I might start messing around with one of my favorite options in Photoshop, which is the hue sat menu, which lives, I always do shortcuts, and so should you, but I think it is image adjustments. There it is, hue saturation. And you can see the shortcut is just Command U. And then I'll just kind of mess around with this and see like, hey, this is kind of cool. I like this. I don't like that.
And this doesn't like apply a filter to it or anything like that. You're like literally changing the colors. So when you're changing it like that, it's actually changing. Yeah.
And it can be a little bit destructive, right? So there is a non-destructive way of working. So destructive is like things that you do, and when you save the file and close it and reopen it the next day, you can't undo them. Whereas non-destructive is you're never doing thing that's final. You can come back and kind of change it as many times as you want later on. You can do edits. With pixel art, though, I think, and this is one of the kind of the funny things I think about pixel art and why I enjoy working with it, is you'll notice that here I've got all my colors on one layer. Like I'm not sure why I've actually put them in a folder, Normally that's what I will do. I'll put all my layers for colors in a folder, because I'll have like basically the horns will be on a different layer, the chest plate will be on a different layer, so that I can make some quick edits, right? Because the selections in Photoshop are all usually kind of anti-alias, and when you're working at large resolutions, you can kind of miss some of the details. But with this is literally just blocks. So I will have no issue whatsoever making a perfectly clean selection of any of these things at the drop of a hat. So I can actually afford to keep all of these things on the same layer and just make some quick edits using the selection tool, which is not normally something that I'd be able to do here.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as well, it's not as complicated, right? Like you don't have gradients or shadows yet, I guess. And it's there's no blurred pixels because everything is absolute. It's binary. It's like one or the other. Exactly.
So this is what we kind of looked at here. There's no curves, right? And technically speaking, if you want to be kind of very technical about it, computers can't do curves unless you're working in Illustrator, where you're working in like mathematics and parabolas and vectors and stuff. Then you can create curves, but you're always going to do pixels. Photoshop just creates an illusion of a curve, but if you zoom in on it, you'll see that it's not. Like, it's just a curve made up of lots and lots and lots of different little squares. So that looks smooth, but really it's pixels. So it's just lots of them making it look like it's a curve.
Yeah.
So here we're not kind of getting any of that, and we're getting a really kind of easy line to select. But let's mess around with the colors here. And again, we can, spend a little bit of time messing around with like, oh, cool, this is nice. Or like, what happens if I make it kind of a little bit monochromatic and see if he's all blue and everything. But what I want to do is I want to do a bit of a crossover, and I want to do Neon Genesis, Evangelion Neon Genesis kind of colors. I want to do Evo 01. So I'm going to take all of this and right click similar, and I'm going to go and get a nice kind of purple to stick in there and fill that like so.
So right click similar, what did that actually do? Similar pixels or similar colors?
Yes, similar colors, right? So I've got all of these pixels are my red pixels, right? So you can see if I get rid of the outline.
Oh, wow. That changes things.
Yeah, a little bit. So all I want to do is basically, because I've used the red everywhere else, I don't want to have to go like hold down shift, which you can see brings up a little like plus icon next to my selection tool when I hold down shift.
Yep.
If I do that, I can just select all the other reds. But, at this point, I don't have too much, so it wouldn't be too much of a pain to do it. But if, get further down into the artwork, you might have a little bit more. Just making one selection and saying right click on that selection, select similar, will select everything else that's red in here.
Nice.
Now, you do have something that you need to be careful of when you're doing this as well, is what is your tolerance. Up here, you got this tolerance. By default, it's set to 15. What this will do is, let's say that I go in here and just slightly change to a very kind of slightly darker red and paint that in here. What my select similar will do is it will literally do similar. It hasn't done it there. Maybe I need to boost that up to like 30 maybe. Let's see if you grab it then. But basically it will go like, yeah, that's close enough. Yeah, there we go. It's grabbed it now.
Right.
So no matter how like the more different the red is, or the higher the tolerance is, the more it'll be tolerant of what it considers to be similar to this red. And so you'll get selections maybe that you didn't intend on having. So let's get rid of that now and drop the selection back down, or the tolerance, back down to 15. Just that's where it's kind of lives by default. And then we can just kind of make this selection, and I'm going to make those green, because we got purple, green, and kind of orange yellow on an Ava, or at least on Ava 01. So we're going to kind of go with that. There we go. And already it's getting a little bit more kind of Evangelion-ish. I want that to be Yeah, I want that to be purple too. And yeah, that's not too bad. I'm going to get the yellow, the kind of color of the eyes here, and make those, I'm going to leave them white actually, because I'm pretty sure that they're white on the actual Ava itself.
So and what came out first? Neon Genesis Evangelion or Gundam? Really? I would have thrown it the other way around.
No, Gundam is like super retro, old school. Like the OG Gundam is like, I'm not sure of my date. Somebody might know this better in chat, but I'm certain that like Evangelion is like 90s. Gundam is like early 80s.
Really? Oh wow! I would have thought it was definitely the other way around.
Nope.
There we
go.
If
you look at if you look at the original Gundam design, you can see that it's like, it looks a little bit boxy and it's a little bit simple. It's not like super crazy cyberpunky kind of vibes. It's very, very kind of like retro robot kind of vibe. That definitely came out before.
It's probably just the way that I watched it. I think I watched it in the other order, so that's probably what did it to me.
Yep. So now we can just kind of make a quick like few selections. We can paint with our brush if we want to kind of get those. Again, always my colors live underneath an outline, so that's why you can see like this is just got a little bit messy real quick. I can clean it up if I want to, but it doesn't really matter because my outlines are living on top of it, so nobody's ever going to see that. But what I can also do here is I can make a quick kind of selection. Now, one of the really cool things about this is because, again, this is really simple, clean pixel art, I can actually go onto my outline layer and use the information on my outline layer to make selections to then apply to my color layer, right? So here's how that works. So I can go in here and make that selection. I won't be able to select similar here because technically this is see-through. Right, so there's no color. So Photoshop won't know what I'm telling it is similar because there's actually nothing there.
Right.
So I can make these like quick blocks of color selections in here, and then I can revert back to my actual color layer. There we go. I think I've got most of it. And then I can hit Option, Delete, and it will fill. I missed a bit, but yeah. So Option Delete will fill, Command Delete will fill with a background color, and we can just kind of do that real quick. So it's up to you. Again, like you can paint it in if you want to. You can use that kind of selection tool if you want to. One of the things that you'll notice when you do this is that obviously it's left out all the outlines in here, which again might not be too much of an issue because we got an outline going over it anyways, so who cares? So again, just like up to you how you want to work. Let's get some more kind of darker tones in here for the hands.
Michael in chat says give him the Xeon treatment.
The Xeon treatment.
Zeon. I thought it might have been a Gundam or a Evangelion that I wasn't aware of, or could it be Xenoblade?
It could be. I don't know. This is maybe where I show that I'm not the super nerd that I say I am.
We all have gaps, all right? I thought, everything came out in the wrong order anyway. Johanna has found out for us the first episode of Mobile Suit Gundam aired in 1979.
Oh, there you go.
Wow. My gosh. There you go.
Yeah, it's super retro, which is, I think, part of the appeal for a lot of people is the kind of retroness. Obviously, they've done like much newer versions of the Neon Genesis. I'm pretty sure is 90s. I think.
Oh, wow.
So again, here I can just kind of go make that selection, go back here, Option Delete, and I can just do these kind of quick fills that will save me some time. So this is kind of like our basic kind of colorway where we've kind of referenced some Gundam shapes. We've got some Neon Genesis colors. We've got a range of different things kind of happening here. And we probably need to get that sword colored in as well. For that, I might go with like an orange, maybe. Again, none of this is like set in stone. I can always kind of go and edit that a little bit later on. By the way, quick little thing here. You can see that as I'm painting, I'm kind of showing this pixel grid, telling me like literally where all the pixels are. How you get rid of that if you want to kind of see your artwork a little bit more smoothly without that kind of grid which gets in the way is just do Command H for hide, and it will hide things like selections, it will hide grids, and it will just show you your artwork as is, which is one of the things that I use a lot actually as well. If I'm doing like, let's say for instance, now I want to change the color of the greens in here. All right, so I'll make that selection of all the greens, go Command U and change that color with my kind of hue saturation kind of slider here. But the what we call the marching ants is like the little indicator of a selection. It's kind of getting in the way of me seeing how that kind of gels with it, because there's a kind of like a white outline around it now. So Command H will hide that. That selection is still active though. So if I change it, so that's a lot more kind of friendly to the eye.
Oh, it gets rid of marching ants as well.
It does, yeah.
I did not know that.
It gets rid of guides, it gets rid of marching ants, gets rid of pixel grids, gets rid of everything, and just like, here's your artwork.
Oh, you know what? I think I've done that accidentally a couple of times before, and I'm like, where are my ants? My ants.
That is one of the shortcuts that I discovered accidentally as well. So it's definitely like, there's a few things that I've discovered by accident, like locking pixels in a layer, pressing on the wrong thing. It's just like, oh, well, hang on, I like that. How did I do that?
Yeah.
So there's definitely some things that can happen that way that are kind of fun and that kind of stick with you as you go forward. So we're just coloring in very quickly, very loosely here, and seeing kind of how that all pans out.
So I just want to talk a little bit about like the application of color as we're going through, because often we'll do things, and I know you've done this before as well, and other artists will come on, kind of have their color palette set. Like they'll have like 5 circles just off the side of the artboard or something, or they'll have maybe they're in their libraries or something. And obviously this is something that will happen if you've got a brand or a client that you're working with. You know, there's something really nice about this like playful approach to applying color to these different things, knowing that it's non-destructive and you can just change it whenever you want. Like, can you talk a little bit about that? Like the two different approaches, like coming in with a set color palette, either from a client or something, and just kind of playing around in Photoshop?
So that's, I mean, color is where I spend like a huge amount of time in Photoshop, kind of going back and forth. And in some ways, having a client tell you have to use these colors can be a little bit of a blessing as well, provided you actually like the colors. But yeah, it just means that it's just like, no, here's what I've ordered, you do that, and don't overthink it. Otherwise, I will definitely tend to overthink and start, messing around for hours on end with different kind of color variations and not actually get any artwork done.
Right.
Which is unfortunate. So there's definitely something like that. But normally what I would do on something like this, and I'll see this when I'm doing shading, is I will work with a color palette. And something that works quite well, I find, is the 60-30-10 rule.
Okay. Explain
the 60-30-10 is basically in this artwork, for instance, right? This is probably not completely 60-30-10, but this is potentially a good example of that. So you want 60% of your artwork to be one color, 30% of the artwork to be another color, and then 10% just for like pickups to be a different color. Now that obviously suggests that you have a 3-color artwork, which is rarely the case for me. But in this instance, like I've got a light purple and a dark purple happening. They would fit within the same color range. So like, for instance, if I do this, right, if I do Command U and then hit colorize, it makes this artwork not monochromatic, but analogous. So everything is this different shades and tones of one color. Which can be an interesting way to work as well. It can give you something to kind of work to and mess around with. But in this instance, this for me is all just one color. So these two purples are one color. The yellow, so 60 would be the purple, probably 30 would be the green. And then if I didn't make this orange, you'd have a 10 for the yellow, just for little pops of highlights here and there throughout the artwork. So that I think is a generally good rule of thumb to mess around with. And then anything on top of that can be extra. With things that I always like to do, and I will make a new layer here because this will be something that I will actually mess around with and get different colors. With something like this, if you've got quite a lot of detail here, this isn't crazy detailed for an illustration, but for pixel art, it's starting to get up there, right? Is lighting. So lighting and shading is going to be a huge deal to like make shapes kind of pop out. So for instance, his helmet is maybe getting a little bit lost in the shoulders. It's like a kind of little bit tricky to see where do the shoulders start and helmet ends. So bringing in lighting is going to do that very easily. And what I would do, or what I really enjoy doing a lot of the time, is getting a super kind of like neon highlight. So let's say that the light is coming from like this direction, right? There's like a neon sign or something next to him. I will come in and just give this a little bit of a highlight where the light is kind of hitting things. And that immediately makes things a little bit clearer because I can start to just bring in a little bit more volume and highlights into things to help kind of differentiate from the helmet from the body and like the hand from whatever else it might be. And it just means that kind of highlights start to appear a little bit and we get a little bit more volume happening through the artwork. And I really like kind of like neons, but what I would do for this is typically I would choose something that's going to be potentially complementary to the main kind of color. So in this instance, what I don't want, for instance, is it to be this yellow because I've already got that yellow in here. So that's confusing for the eye. But I also wouldn't necessarily want it to be like a lightish purple like this, because then it just looks like a highlight. It just looks like that's just that color, but in a lighter version of itself. So that's slightly different, right?
Yeah,
so
I would have thought that you would want like a lighter version of the color to reflect the light.
So that's different, right? So that's different because what we're talking about here, and this is how I would generally do something like this, is now, because this is not natural light, this is like a neon reflector light, right?
Right, okay, so it's picking up the color of the light. It's not like a diffused light source. Okay. Okay,
so what I like to do is there's a neon light coming from over here, right? And then on the other side, what I will do is I'll just do a normal natural light coming from the other side and then put my shading on the side where the neon is, which will make it pop more, if that makes sense. So this is what I would do if I was making neon kind of highlights, and a lot of my artwork does this, where essentially what you're looking at, if I do let me give you kind of a basic quick little guide of what I'm kind of talking about here. Let me just hide, make a new layer. Sorry, I'm all over the place today. There we go. Get our purple going. There we go. Right. So what is generally going to happen for me on something is I'm going to go, okay, there's a natural light occurring from this angle. So I'm going to go and get like a lighter version of and paint in with a bigger brush, maybe paint in some highlights into here. Because it's pixel art, you probably want to kind of make that a little bit more of a kind of like a gradation and get some kind of tones happening, so that kind of gives the illusion of kind of a smooth light happening.
Right.
And get even brighter over here, real kind of like highlight, depending on how kind of like shiny that ball is. And then we're going to go back in here and get a little bit darker or a lot darker, depending on. So this is now going to kind of sit there. So this is just your standard kind of like shading on a sphere. But what's going to be cool is if I put my highlight now, so my blue kind of highlight, if I put that over there, it doesn't really pop as much because these are already light tones. Whereas if I put it down here, that really starts to sing, right? So that's what I would normally do, is a kind of like a small light coming from over here, and then a natural light, which is a little bit more pervasive, coming from the opposite side. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
So that's what I'm kind of going for with this, is getting that kind of bounce light is what it's generally kind of referred to, because it means that there's like a light bouncing off of a certain character coming onto that kind of image there, which means that then there's going to need to be a little bit more of a kind of like a mood shading happening on this. And it just gives it a little bit more kind of like that cyberpunk vibe that I like.
Yeah.
So I'm doing this very, very quickly. And I'm not sure that I will do this to this particular piece of pixel art because it might be a little bit too tricky. And for moving forward as well, with what we're going to talk about in a sec with shading is, not sure what happened there, is going to be a little bit tricky to do and the line work. So I might just hide this for now. And we're going to work with some basic kind of highlights and shading. So again, I could go super painterly and start messing around on this same layer. I could start going in and getting some highlights and things in to get some of that volume in, to get a little bit more clarity back in here. All right, so this is literally just me painting in. This is quite destructive in that if I want to make a change, I need to like paint it out. It might be a little bit kind of tricky for me to do that later on. If I decide I want to change the color of the Gundam, it might be tricky as well. So it's always a little bit kind of, you got to think about what it is that you're trying to do and what you're likely to want to do potentially later on, before you decide whether you're going to stick this all on the same layer or not. What I would normally do is cheat a little bit, or not cheat a little bit necessarily, but just take the options that Photoshop is giving me, and I'm going to do an adjustment layer. So this is non-destructive, right? So I can go in fact, I'm going to do that bit for shading, and then I will do something else for the highlights. So on your group here, we want to go in down to the bottom, and this little kind of circle cut in half, and then go and do hue saturation. It'll open up that similar-ish kind of menu that we saw. And now I can change this to like a darker tone. But you've noticed that it's doing the background gray as well. So we don't want that. We want to kind of keep it a little bit just to the artwork itself. And how you do that is you make sure that this is above your group. Double click back onto here, and then click this little guy, which means that it will only affect the group or layer immediately underneath it. So this is not being affected by the adjustment that I've just created. And it creates a very convenient layer mask for me on that adjustment, which means that I can then come in here with black and white. And you'll notice as soon as I click on that layer adjustment where these two guys are light purple and purple, if I click on that mask, it defaults to black and white, because you can only paint with black and white. And then I can start hiding some of the information that I've darkened in here. And this is just a really quick and easy way to get some shading happening. Now, the really cool thing about this is if I go into my Gundam layer here, the colors, and I change the colors, that layer mask will affect whatever is underneath it accordingly.
Yeah, that's crazy.
If I decide to go with that, it's just shading that's just waiting for stuff to go on underneath it. Right?
It's so cool, and like I've seen you do this in other streams as well in non-pixel art. So this is obviously a technique that you can apply to
Yes.
all of your illustrations. And every time you do it, I'm like, I need to go back and watch exactly the steps that you did because it's super cool, and make sure I do it myself. I'm always like, what's that thing? What's that crazy thing that Jeremy does where he just allows this like full freedom, like because it's still drawing, right? And it's a very playful approach.
Still painting.
Yeah, it's still painting, and it's non-destructive, as you said. So that's the secret sauce. That little 1 minute there.
That is,
I need to clip that.
The quick little thing that I use for shading, at least. I don't necessarily use this for highlights because you'll see why you can't put two adjustment layers on the same locked thing. You can stack as many adjustment layers as you want on a thing.
Right.
But if I put in another adjustment layer now onto this, in fact, maybe that's wrong. Maybe I can do this way. Let's just see. Playing around with this now and seeing, can I lock it? Yes, I can. Okay, so you can actually do a highlight layer as well.
Right.
And start messing around with that. But again, this for me is a more like of a personal thing where for highlights, I just tend to prefer having them on a separate layer just because I can kind of manipulate them a bit better. It might not be the smartest way to work. It might not be the way that like people would be like, oh yeah, that's the most like efficient way to do it. But it is nonetheless the way that I prefer to do it. And I often think it's like that kind of concept of like, how do you want to do it? Not necessarily the most efficient way to do it, the one that you enjoy the most. Right. It's a little bit like if you kind of like, Google Maps or any kind of equivalent thing that's going to direct you to where you want to go, by default is always going to assume that you want to take the least amount of time to get to your destination.
Right. That's not always the case. Yeah.
Well, maybe there's a nicer way to walk to work. And yeah, it takes an extra 5 minutes, but it goes through a really nice park and that's what you want to do. And so like, I think that is kind of the same kind of thing. It's like, yep, okay, it might not be the most efficient way, but it's the way that I dig the most. And so that's what I'm going to do. And nobody can tell me that that's wrong. So
it's true. I was in that situation not that long ago when I was just in an area that I didn't know very well. And I was driving around doing all sorts of stuff, and it sent me this way where I was like going across back streets, zigzagging, then crossing main roads in like kind of difficult, unfamiliar territory where it's like, cool. Like once you get across this main road that didn't have a set of lights, so you had to kind of go out against traffic, and then you had to get all the way on the other side of the road. Now, if you know the area super well, it's probably a lot easier. But if you don't, it's like, I don't want to deal with that. I'd rather go straight along that road further and then cut in and spend an extra 10 minutes in the drive or whatever, just to keep things simple. So yeah, you're right. There's all sorts of different reasons. Hey D in chat, it's been a long time. Hope you're doing well.
Hey. So I've got some shading now, and I can change this as well if I want to, make that warmer or colder shading. I can kind of mess around with that a little bit too, and see how that goes. I can darken it, make it very, very dark, a little bit harder to read. So there's a lot that I can do to this, and this is completely non-destructive. If I save and close and come back, it'll still be there for me to edit it. It's one of the ways that I really enjoy working. But what I can also do sometimes is, for pixel art in particular, I might also start to, make, let me just hide this for a sec so I can actually select my actual color, get a darker version. There we go. Bring that back on and start bringing in a third level of light. So it's not just like light and dark. There's a third level of like middle ground here where it's going to start to be a little bit more kind of detailed for me. And again, you could do this, as you saw here, I'm painting on the green because I'm painting with a purple. It's getting rid of the green. So what I could do is put this on multiply, and it's going to make it a little bit darker. But then if I go onto the green, it'll kind of match up a little bit better to that. So it's just going to make it so that I don't have to switch colors. It's a little bit less painterly, but it's a little bit more friendly to kind of manipulate it that way.
Really like the orange or the red on the sword. I think it's really nice.
Oops. Yeah, it's a good little pickup, I think, for the overall kind of colors that are there at this stage.
Also, everyone, we've got about 15 minutes left, so if you've got any questions while we're going along, anything that you want to see again or anything that hasn't been covered, throw them in chat. We're happy to answer them. Is there anything I missed? There was a question I missed, actually. What is the most amount of color you've ever used in a piece? Do you remember?
I'm not going to answer that question. I don't know.
5.
It'd be like 30 maybe.
Right. Hopefully something that wasn't being printed.
Stuff can start to get, or screen printed at least.
Screen printed, yeah. Or
it can start to get pretty like hectic very quickly if you do stuff. But yeah, again, it's just a matter of like, what are you trying to do? Why are you doing it? And who's it for as well is obviously have a big impact on that. But it's just that's probably a little bit crazy. Like 30 plus colors in your artwork is probably too many, because it's just, you want to kind of try and have some sort of limitation on how many different combinations are possible for your artwork, because then that's when stuff starts to get a little bit kind of too crazy. If it's like, oh, what if the horns were a different color, and then the sword was a different color? That's a combination that I haven't. And then the more combinations you have, the more permutations of like this yellow, that green, that blue, and this orange is like, oh,
right.
It's nice to just try and keep it a little bit more, a little bit simpler that way, so that you don't have to worry too much about what's going on. But just quickly before we kind of head into the end bit, what I want to kind of talk about now is the colors are not finished, but they're basically kind of, that process is just now time needs to go into it to get it nice and clean. But I want to talk about the outlines. So not all pixel art will have this like black outline around everything, which can be a little bit tricky to work with, because a black outline indicates that there's a line here, right? And it's a physical line. So it's one of those things, for instance, let me switch to my other artwork and kind of show you exactly what I'm kind of talking about here. If you draw a face, right? You draw somebody's face, and they're smiling, right? So the big smile on them. As soon as you do these guys, right? So most people will have these lines that appear on them when they smile. But if you draw them, you've added like 30 years to this person instantly. So you don't do this with line work, you do it with shading. And shading is one of the things that is very often used to create the sense of volume rather than actual line work. So these thick black outlines, they can be a style. It is definitely a way of working, but there is another way to kind of do this, if you will, which is I'm going to duplicate this and I'm going to lock this layer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make all of my outlines the same color as the thing that they're outlining, but just with different variations of light and dark. So here's how this works. For the horns, for instance, I'm going to go on the side where there's light. I'm going to go with a lighter yellow and create that outline. Now I've locked this background layer, this outline layer, so that I don't paint anywhere else than that outline. And what that's going to do basically is it's just going to make my outline or my drawing feel a little bit less like heavy, a little bit less kind of hemmed in by the line work. It's a little bit more like that's just the shape that exists there, if you can see what I'm kind of doing there. It doesn't have that heavy duty outline around it. It just feels a little bit more kind of painterly. And it's one of the little tricks that you can do when you're doing your outlines, is to kind of just get them to match up with the color that they are outlining.
Right.
And it just means that, like on this gem, for instance, on this thing that's here, we can start to kind of see things a little bit more clearly and a little bit more distinctly because we're not outlining everything. And so that just means that we've got a little bit more room to breathe.
Right. So which would you prefer normally, to have an outline or not to have an outline?
Probably not outline. Sorry, not black outline is probably more traditional pixel art.
Right.
Because it has that kind of option to create a little bit more kind of flow in that artwork where you're not looking to necessarily get like heaps of shading, but you can still get that definition without getting this like crazy thick black outline on something. And it just means, like you can see here on the helmet, that's kind of starting to come to life a little bit more, a little bit less kind of heavy. Yeah. Now, obviously that is a little bit less defined if I have that on here, but if I drop that to black, you can see the difference in between these two, right? That's quite heavy, and the outline is there, really is kind of drawn in, whereas here it's more just kind of painted in on the helmet.
Yeah.
So it's one of those ways that's just a little bit kind of nicer and clearer to work. If I go in on here and whoops, that's the wrong layer. Go in on these guys, make these purple. It's like dark purple rather than the black that I've got, so that the black can then be reserved for things that are actually black, like the contour of those eyes, the kind of the range of the helmet here, all these things that are going to be actually the colors that I need them to be are going to be a lot more clear to kind of identify as that thing rather than being black. And you can see immediately, again, that difference happening as I'm doing this. So on these vents, for instance, on the chest, having that not be black in the middle just opens them up a little bit more, just makes them a little bit easier to manage and less kind of hectic. So that's one way to kind of do it. And that, obviously it takes a little bit of time. I'm working on this layer that's locked, but you can see that looks a little bit more kind of pixel arty already,
right?
Compared to this. It feels a little bit more like there's volumes happening. The third way to do that is with same thing, right? Same outlines, but now we're going to put a black outline around just on the contour of that artwork. So not anywhere inside the artwork, just on the surrounding elements of that artwork, just to help that get a little bit more defined and kind of popping out, depending on what you're doing, again, depending on kind of the overall aspect that you're trying to get to achieve in this pixel art. But yeah, so you've got full black outline around everything like a drawing. Then you've got a little bit more of a painterly outline where you're starting to just use shading to do the outline rather than actual shapes. And then you've got a kind of a mix in between the two where you've got the shading, but we're also going to give it a little bit more sharpness and definition by sticking an outline only around the outside.
Right. And then you've got a bit more of that real estate on the inside for the features and details as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And you can cheat a little bit. It's like I say, like exclusively on the outside, but this kind of horn here is very much in the front. So you could potentially just cut into this a little bit with that outline. So it's not necessarily only contour. And that just means that it's going to be creating that volume again a little bit more clearly. So those are the three different outlines. The one that I would probably prefer is this third option here, where it's painterly outlines in the middle with a contour around the outside just gets a little bit more kind of style and graphic. But for the actual drawing part of it, it's good to just draw with just one color. You don't have to think about what the colors are going to be that you're going to put in. So those are the three kind of main options when it comes to coloring all this in. And then we can start to think about like what effects we're going to put in behind it and everything else, and how that's all going to kind of come in and work. So for instance, here, if I had some time, I'd start putting in some types. So we've got Mecha Shogun written in Japanese.
How do you find that? Because do you translate it or something? Or
I use two websites. One is DeepL, which is great, and the other one is G-Show.
Do you use two so that you compare and make sure that it's right?
Yeah. So one of them is a dictionary.
Yeah.
Which gives you some context, but so G-Show is a dictionary, just literally translates the words straight up. Whereas DeepL gives you a little bit of context. Like if you were trying to say, for instance, I don't know, let's say he's like threatening somebody, he's been like, time to die. So time to die is an expression, and if you translate that strictly in Japanese, it's literally going to say like death o'clock or something equally like out of context.
Death o'clock.
I use those things.
That's awesome.
to just make sure that I'm like not doing something silly and stupid and out of context. The last thing I wanted to kind of chat about before kind of time runs out is this idea of your selections. We mentioned this in the first part of the stream last week, but by default, Photoshop wants to make things nice and smooth and clean for you. It wants to avoid this kind of like jagged edge of pixelation and make it nice and clean. So if I fill this now, I've got this like basic selection. If I fill this with a pink, you'll notice that it's actually doing things that potentially I don't want it to do, where it's not just pink. I've got 3 different shades of pink here happening. Because Photoshop is trying to make this kind of look and feel like it's nice and smooth. So what you want to do to the bulk of your selection tools is make sure that anti-aliasing is unticked. And then what'll happen when I do this is I'll get that nice jaggedy edge, which is horrible when you're doing anything else but pixel art.
Right.
So your magic wand will have this, your selection tools will have this. Your rectangle selection tool doesn't have it because rectangles are pixels already. There is no curve. It's just horizontal or vertical. The whole thing is an alias. So it will only happen to these kinds of things where you've got actual curves happening in your selection.
Right.
And then we can start to kind of mess around a little bit and see. We had a highlight in here. Let's make our type that color so that just looks like a neon sign that's kind of lighting his face. Always good to like show the source of the lighting that you're doing as well.
Right.
We can make that black. There we go. And let's go a little bit 80s.
Why not? Bit 80s.
Yeah.
Got about 1 minute left, and then we'll need to say our goodbyes.
Let's grab all of this and hide this and make it a little bit of a sunset. Oops, wrong selection tool. There we go. Delete. Move up, delete. Move up, delete. Bingo. There we go.
That's a bingo.
That's a bingo.
Cool.
So there we go. We got our little pixel art nice and ready to go and ready to be animated, which is a whole nother ball game.
Yeah, totally. Little bit of animation in Photoshop. Maybe we should do that, especially like the GIF-based animations. That's always super fun.
Oh, how much time have we got left? Have we got time for like a quick 20-second thing real quick?
20-second thing you got? Yeah, let's go. We'll give Johanna a heart attack. Let's do it.
All right, so quickly, because obviously this is minute, this is tiny. If you wanted to print this on a regular, let's grab an A4 and make that 300 DPI. If I grab all of this, I'm going to just flatten it all real quick, smash it onto this layer. obviously this is going to be ridiculously small, right? So if you want to rescale this to something, all you need to do is drag it in there, Command T, make sure that by default, this is set to bicubic automatic. If you set it to nearest neighbor, when you scale it, it will stay that scale.
Yeah.
And that's it. So now you've got this at a good printable resolution without having like smashed all your pixels to bits.
So there you go. Nearest neighbor is
that's right.
what you need to pick there. All right, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Those who joined us last week. Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks for hanging out with us. This has been great.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Always a lot of fun. Yeah, we'll see you all at the next Adobe Live. We got to go before we get cut off. See you later.
See ya. Thanks.
Bye.